Well, it's a great pleasure, and thank you very much indeed, Chris, for organising this talk and my visit. Sarah, my first visit to East Germany, as it was, Halle, this whole area. It's a great pleasure to be here and to come to the birthplace of my greatest hero, perhaps, along with Max Planck, who I'll go to later, Handel. I love Handel, and it's lovely to be in his city and to be talking here in the place where he was born. Chris asked me to talk about socialism and other matters, so I will address socialism to a certain extent in the first part of this talk, and then move beyond that into other things on which I'm currently working. The puzzle which I'm going to address today is, I think, the puzzle out of which most of the social sciences developed in the Enlightenment in the 18th century, and then were refreshed by the same puzzle after the Industrial Revolution in the later 19th century. And this is the puzzle of what holds the world together, what can hold our world together in those societies which have gone through the, as Polanyi would put it, the great transformation, which has led to a world which cannot be any more based solely on the old unifiers, namely kinship and religion. What is going to join us together, and that is behind the work, I think, of nearly all the great thinkers, from Adam Smith and Rousseau onwards. So that's the meta problem behind what I'm going to talk to you about today. In order to look at this problem, I want to widen it from the way it was posed usually in the first forms, which was in relation to the nation or the nation-state or a particular civilization, to look at it at a global imperial empire level. So I want to look at empires and what holds them together. That's the question that I'm trying to begin to look at today. Now, in order to do that, and here's the plan, do that with active empire, including the Islamic and Chinese. But if we look at certain empires, we can group them a little bit. There are what I term to myself the cultural empires. Those are the empires, particularly European empires like French, Spanish, and Portuguese, which are based ultimately on a unity of culture, that is, one religion, one language, one educational system. So those empires were set up to try and hold themselves together by uniting under cultural features. And they didn't last very long, a few hundred years, and then they fragmented. And they weren't entirely successful, and in their deaths or endings, they were often very tragic, because the renunciation of these empires was a renunciation of identity, and in the case of the French in Vietnam and so on, or Morocco and the rest of it, it's very difficult to give up a cultural empire. That's one kind of empire which was not really based on something that could hold it together for very long. The most successful empire, and I hope you don't think I'm boasting about this, but the most successful in terms of the length at which it lasted and also its size, was the British Empire. And this was an associational empire. It wasn't based on an identity of everyone speaking one language, but it was based on political and social bonds and economic bonds which associated different parts of the world. Of course, there were two main phases. There was the first empire, which was based on Jamaica and the Caribbean, and then the second empire based on India. And there was a huge distinction between the white empire, like Canada and Australia, and the black empire. But fundamentally, it was based on an association of legal, administrative, political, and other joining features. And it lasted a very long time and held a great set of people together. Then there were the 20th century empires, and these I call the ideological empires. There was the Japanese, which lasted a very short time. There was the Soviet empire, the socialist empires of this part of the world, which are, again, historically very short-lived, only, what, a little over half a century, 1917 to 1989, and they collapsed very, very fast. And part of the background and things we might talk about is why it was that the way they were held together, which is by ideology, meant that they really had a hollow core and therefore collapsed almost straight away. There was nothing really inside them. They were empty empires of ideology. Now, the reason why they were empty, I think, is because they were based, and I'm going to skim very, very fast across this, they were based on two types of ideology. I should have mentioned the other one, of course, is fascism, which was even shorter. These two ideological variants of the 20th century were based on false premises about the nature of man and what holds us together and who we are. The communist ones, of course, were based on Marx's view, and his view is based on a false anthropology, as I'm sure you all know, which suggests that the original state of human beings is almost like a herd of animals. It's a community which doesn't have property, doesn't have class, doesn't have a state, very little separation. And his ideological dream, his utopian millenarian dream, was to return to that first Garden of Eden and to destroy all the things that have grown up since then. And as we know, it was a total disaster, not only there but in China, for the reasons which, among others, George Orwell has pointed out, that if you destroy these things, you can't destroy them. They come back to a state, and talking here in East Germany, where you see the extreme form of it, where only fear, repression can finally hold such a system together, and the state becomes more and more powerful, and less, rather than less and less. You know the story well enough. So the Marxist vision leads to a utopian empire which is totally unsustainable. The other great 19th century vision, or another one, is the vision of Durkheim. And the experiment that comes from Durkheim, not directly as it does with Marx, but in a sense it stems from Durkheim's vision, is that, as you know, Durkheim's trajectory led him back to his solution to the problems of anomie and rootlessness and what could possibly hold us together, to examining the earliest forms. Again, the Garden of Eden, again, Australian Aborigines who are held together in the end by euphoria, by effervescence, by the collective will, by reinforcing their togetherness through ritual and so on. Of course, he never then showed how you got from a few thousand people coming together for what I gather will happen over here tomorrow, a lot of drinking and partying, how you get from that to the modern world. But that kind of tendency, which is a very French tendency, which goes back to Rousseau and the general will, leads through, I think, directly to totalitarian fascism, and is an unsuccessful way of solving the problem of how we build ourselves together. So those solutions and those types of empire were, again, not at all satisfactory. But turning back to the least bad, I mean, all empires are dreadful, but I think one of the least bad empires is the British Empire. I'm trying to understand how that was held together, which is what I now want to talk about, which will give you, I think, an alternative model to socialism, an entirely different way of doing it. Turning to that, I want to just now look at one or two theories which might, might think would be useful for understanding how empires are held together. The first is Adam Smith, because in a way his work is again trying to see how transactions and reciprocities and the market will hold together a minimalist state. It doesn't abolish the state, but the market is the primary mechanism. But he would have been the first to admit that that isn't really what can hold together people. It helps a bit, but in the end, transacting individuals are held together in an associational state where they are not united in their emotional and mental lives. So this is Gesellschaft, is what he's describing, associational life. But you need much more Gemeinschaft, much more community, to hold together something very large like a modern empire. And this, I think, just as an aside, one of the interesting things is how short-lived the American empire has been, the North American empire, and also the fact that it really hasn't propagated itself. It has spread economically. It's an economic empire, and of course a cultural empire, and many of the things that are used in many parts of the world in the cultural sphere come from America. But there are not many American flags flying over distant parts of the globe, fortunately, for all of us and for the Americans. But it hasn't been a very long-lived or very widespread predatory land or sea-based empire. So I don't think Smith really helps us much. Moving on to Karl Polanyi's work. I mention him because I know, partly because I know that you've had other seminars on Polanyi, and he's a very distinguished, interesting thinker. And particularly his work on the institutionalization of the market is something which we all need to know about. But his other work, and I disagree here with Chris, maybe, his work on the Great Transformation in the 18th century, I think, is a little fiction. He didn't know much about later economic history, as far as I can see. He certainly didn't bring it to bear on this in that book. And therefore he made up a great divide in the 18th century, which really didn't exist. And also, his work doesn't help in the modern period, really, because it's really, like Smith's, it's about economic relations. There are moral and other elements, but they're not at the forefront. So it doesn't really help my quest for an answer to what holds the British Empire together. The work of another thinker who I've found very interesting in many ways, and I'm sure you have too, is Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities. And that's why I've put the word imagined empires into my title, because I think it is all about the imagination. I think what holds us together is imagination, really, about thinking of who we are and how we're connected. But his solution, his work doesn't help in two ways. One is, as you know, it's mainly focused on the problem of what allowed or created, generated and maintained the nation state. So he's not concerned, as far as I can see, in that his early work anyway, at the imperial world level. But you could kind of extend his model a bit. But when you do, and you take his famous two theories about the reasons for the development of nationalism, print and capitalism, i.e. Alan Smith, those are clearly not going to hold together a great empire. Printing is part of it, as are all media communication, but it's only a very small part of it. You don't become, or you don't hold together a great empire on the basis of reading books or printing or reading newspapers. It's certainly part of it, but it's only a very small part of it. So I haven't found in that part of the literature any solution, because my question, to reiterate it, is what generates attachment to empire? I'm talking about really the ruling of the empire and the joining together of the empire, but it also filters down, right down through many parts, down to other aspects of the empire as well as the rulers. What makes people feel they are parts of something bigger than themselves, which is Anderson's question. But what keeps the bonds between far-flung parts of the world? And in the end, how did the largest ruling machine that the world has ever known, bigger than the Chinese, Mongolia, in terms of numbers anyway, or the Roman empires, what helped generate this machine? What created the imagination of the imagined empire? I'm going to just introduce you, since some of you may not know this quite interesting book, to one further theory to try and explain this. This is by a lady called Tidrick. This was published about 1990, a book called Empire and British Character. And Catherine Tidrick, the subtitle, The Illusion of Authority, I think is a misplaced subtitle. It wasn't an illusion, it was authority, but I can see what she's getting at. Her question is, how was it that a small number of people from a small country could rule the largest empire the world has ever known? And her answer is that it's through character. It's through what she calls the responsibility system of indirect rule. Now, I won't go into it in detail. Her book is very interesting, worthwhile, but I'll just give you a couple of examples of what she means. She quotes a well-known socialist journalist, E.D. Morel, who was pretty critical of the empire, but he went to northern Nigeria in 1910 and he wrote, "When one sees this man managing almost single-handed a country as large as Scotland, when one sees that man living in a leaky, muddy hut, holding by the sway of his personality the balance even between fiercely antagonistic races, in a land which would cover half a dozen of the large English counties, when one sees the marvels accomplished by tact, passionate interest and self-control, with utterly inadequate means, in continuous personal discomfort, short-handed on poor pay out here in northern Nigeria, then one feels that permanent evil cannot ultimately evolve from so much admirable work accomplished, and that the end must be good." So it almost persuaded him that the British Empire was doing some good somewhere. The trick, according to Tidrick, was the difficult task of ruling without actually appearing to rule at all. And this was described by a lieutenant governor of southern Nigeria. Authority combined with self-effacement. The archetypal hero and kind of epitome of all this is Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, who was entranced by the conviction that he was controlling the Arabs without their ever realizing it. That's a quote. And the kind of manual for this system was written by the great imperial governor Lugard in his book The Dual Mandate. When a few score are responsible for the control and guidance of millions, his courage must be undoubted, his word and pledge absolutely inviolate, his sincerity transparent. There is no room for mean whites in tropical Africa. They lower the prestige by which alone the white race can hope to govern and to guide. Well, anyone who's started looking at colonial feudal archives finds plenty of mean whites, as you can imagine. But that was the ideal type. Tidrick outlines it a little bit with some of these quotations. But I want to now fill it out a little bit, because I went through this. Anthropologists, as you know, engage in participant observation. I wasn't aware that through the days of my childhood up to my 20s, I was going through a very interesting piece of fieldwork. I wasn't systematically keeping notes, though I did keep all the bits of paper that I could from quite early on in my life. So I have the field ethnographic the training for this kind of system. And so I am now trying to reconstruct, through my own psychological experience and my historical documents, which are boxes and boxes and boxes of letters and papers, what this machine, this, as I described it with reference to Bourdieu, habitus factory, was trying to create. What is the output? As you know with Bourdieu, the problem is he describes the outputs of habitus, and it's much more difficult to know how the machine creates this output. Well, I want to just now explain a little more about what I was being trained to be, and what the British for some centuries were trying to teach them, at least the elite, which was going to run this empire. And this is based on an article, I think, by Foster, called The Peasant Image of the Good Peasant, or some such. And so it's a model of what I was being indoctrinated between the age of 6 or 7 and about 25. I was to have a good mind. This consisted of both content and form. The content were things like language ability, which I've had in very sparse amount, I'm afraid, but they tried to teach me Latin and French and the rest of it in Greek. There was writing and expressing myself, a sense of history, of geography, of the classics of literature, and a dash of science. This was to give me the tools of thought and expression, to be able to argue, persuade, solve problems generally, and generally lead other people confidently. As an aside, as you may know, we are having an election at the moment, and if as is likely our new government is a Conservative one, 7 out of 15 or 20 of the cabinet will come from one public school of the type I'm describing, Eton. And both Clegg and Cameron came from those kinds of school, and when they were engaged in their oratory, this was the product of Winchester and Eton. This was to give us the tools of thought and expression, as I say, and the training was rather general, because you didn't know what the output would be. They might be politicians, but they might well be doctors, administrators, lawyers, managers, academics, anyone who needed these intellectual gifts or a competent education of that kind. On the other hand, work was not everything. You mustn't make too much of it, and you shouldn't be arrogant about your successes. You shouldn't be, as the English put it, over-braining. No suspicion of anyone who's too intellectual or too obsessive about work. But that was one of the requisites and something you're being taught. Perhaps more important was that you should have a good body. You may not see one in front of you this evening, but the idea was that we were to be toughened up. The disciplining of children through games, sports, and toughening up and beating and all the other things that went on in these schools is about toughening the body. It all seems bizarre now, but if you think of the main period up to the end of the British Empire, this was a world before much of modern medicine, inadequate heating, limited food, and people who were going to go to very primitive conditions, as was described in northern Nigeria. So the games ethic, the physical hardening, the Spartan part of the education of all these schools, was part of the training for that. It was also to train you against boredom and loneliness and all the other virtues that games were supposed to provide in terms of working with other people and team spirit and by rules and all the rest of it. Again, if you were good at things, were just one thing, and you should be modest about your achievements. The thing wasn't to win, but was to try as hard as you could. Commitment and effort, rather than necessarily being outstanding at it. That was what was being aimed at. Then there was the good moral life. Here the school was setting up goals of virtue, sacrifice, purity of thought and action, avoidance of lying and deceit, of honesty, kindness and decency. Now, even saying these words nowadays in our cynical world sounds a bit strange. Surely no one believes in any of all those virtues, but that was what was publicly proclaimed, and I assumed that those were the sort of things I was being expected to follow. Much of this, of course, is taught at home, but it was also to be inculcated through our education at school. So school life was about ethics. In case you're wondering how the school could do all this, as I'll explain a bit later if you don't know about the British system, we were shut away within what Goffman would call an asylum for 3/4 of every year between the age of 8 and 18. Those 10 years we were in an asylum which was indoctrinating us with all these things, the good ethical life, the good moral life and so on. And turning to moral life, there was the good spiritual life. This was wider than formal Christianity. The schools I went to weren't really, they were a bit sceptical of formal Christianity. Of course, you had to go through the motions for the parents, but the teachers were clearly not really convinced by this. Some of them were atheists and agnostics. But the outward form had to be preserved, as with Oxford and Cambridge colleges now, for example. But it was a wider kind of spirituality. It was the value of the human spirit. We were to ponder on the meaning of life, to come to some idea of what we thought our spiritual goals should be. And we should practice the Christian virtues, if not believing in the dogma. And as Gandhi put it, you judge a rose by its smell, but not by what it proclaims itself to be. So if we smell sweet and Christian, then that's what we should aim at. And finally, we were to be filled with good emotions. This is especially important. Good emotions included things like self-confidence, cheerfulness, overcoming of loneliness, the art of attracting people to one's personality, the sort of thing I mentioned in relation to colonial officers, and of being attracted by them, the arts of love, of hate, attachment and attachment. This is a very complex web of emotions we were being inculcated into. And again, you may wonder, well, what was the school got to do with this? If you have a modern school and you send your children there for lessons, you don't expect the school to be teaching all this emotional and spiritual side nearly as much. But these schools were taking children out of their homes. They hardly, in my case, saw their parents for 10 years, and therefore the school was taking over the role of building the emotional structure of the children within it. In all these spheres and others, which I can't go into, we were being inculcated into a model of the English gentleman. He, and occasionally she, was to be tough, trustworthy, humorous, self-deprecating, clever, a leader of men, individualistic yet a team player, able to overcome obstacles in the most difficult situations, a survivor and a true Christian knight. Bits of these models you find in Chaucer and in Shakespeare, English poetry and so on. And against it was the model of the bad pupil or Englishman. A bad sport, a liar, a fanatic, a bully, a libertine, a toady, a swot, a cheat. Now, you may think all this is pretty improbable, and I'll add to your feeling about that by giving you two quotations. One is a description of one of the masters at the school I went to, my first boarding school, the preparatory school. The school was extraordinary, and one of the extraordinary features of it was that we always called our masters by nicknames to their faces. So this master was known to the boys before the Second World War as Cheese. Cheese's standard of conduct was a simple one. His good man was one who was generally believed to be faithful to his wife and reasonably sober, who looked you in the eye and told the truth at awkward times, who was either good at work or games, or had enough sense of humour to make you forgive him his incompetence in either, preferably not both of his respects. This good man could be modest about all these accomplishments, and Cheese in his turn was modest about his athletic distinction, his looks, and his prestige both in the school and in the university. My description of his families may be cynical. My feelings about Cheese are not. He was and is a gentleman, and boys from the school do not commonly lose their respect for him as they grow older and discern his failings. That's one description of a master at my preparatory school. This is a description, a poetic description, by one of the old boys of that school, who ended up as poet laureate, John Betchman. And he is describing the perfect boy at this preparatory school, who is called Percival Mandeville. This is from his poetic autobiography, Summoned by Bells, which some of you may know. Percival Mandeville, the perfect boy, was all a schoolmaster could wish to see. Upright and honourable, good at games, well-built, blue-eyed. A sense of leadership lifted him head and shoulders from the crowd. His work was good. His written answers made in a round, tidy and decided hand pleased the examiners. His open smile enchanted others. He could also frown on anything unsporting, mean or base, unworthy of the spirit of the school and what it stood for. Unfortunately, Betchman falls out with Percival Mandeville. They're having some lie or something, and Mandeville is going to challenge him to a fight, and then Betchman discovers he has a sick aunt who he has to go and visit rather hurriedly, so he gets out of it. That's the story behind this bit of poetry. But that's the kind of perfect boy. Now, I want to move on next to describing how this system worked in practice. And here I'll take you to the diagram here, which I've devised. Now, as you know from your anthropology, nearly always societies have the problem of moving children between childhood and through adolescence and puberty into adulthood, and many of them have mechanisms for doing this, puberty rituals and withdrawal into camps and boys and girls encampments and so on and so on. And at first, when I started looking at this, I thought that the British public school, by that we mean of course private school, the Etons and Winchesters and so on, schools, were sort of dealing with the problems of puberty and the movement from childhood to adulthood. That was their main function, logically. The oddness, which has struck me more and more since I started working on this, is that we in Britain started doing this well before puberty. At 7 or 8, sometimes 6, you were taken out, if you were in the elite, out of your home and placed in a boarding institution well away from home in the charge of strangers. And this, as far as I know, on a large scale in civilization is unique. I don't know of anywhere else that has done this for hundreds of years, as you'll see. The reason I think it was done so early, there are other reasons and functions for it, but one of the reasons is the realization, which the Jesuits of course had too, which was that if you're going to be molding character, emotions and personality, and not just the mind, you have to start very early. As a headmaster of Eton put it, a child's character changes little in essentials after the age of 12 or 13. That's when you go to boarding school, second school. So you had to do it in the 5 years before that. And going through my own letters and other scraps of information and memories, I realised that by the time I went to my public school, I was largely formed. But I wasn't when I went at the age of 8 to the first school. Or as the greatest writer on delaying adulthood put it, Sir James Barrie, who wrote Peter Pan, put it, nothing, he said, that happens after we are 12 matters very much. And I've also discovered this to be true through the interviews I've been doing of many important achievers, academics, musicians and others, which are on my website. And I started just out of interest asking them about their childhoods and their parents. But it's become a very large theme in it, because I discovered that although they can't remember much, they realise that by the age of 12, 13, 14, much of what they are has already been named out. So this very early stage is the preparatory school from 8 to 13. The metaphor that came to my mind about this whole process is, if any of you know how you make a Japanese sword, the way you strengthen a Japanese sword is that you take this steel and you heat it, and then you beat it. And then you bend it over and you heat it and you beat it again. You bend it over, you do that 500 or 600 times. By the time you've finished that and then you sharpen it, you have the best blade that the world has ever seen. This was, the system was more or less perfect by the 12th century. It could cut through almost anything. Fantastically hard. And this is in a sense what this system is doing. It took us, and it literally, because we were beaten of course, actually I wasn't, but most people were beaten, but you're psychologically beaten and conditioned for 5 years. You're away from anyone you know, you're given no private space, you're taught, you're in an entirely different environment, no one can help you, you're on your own, and you are beaten into shape. But gradually you move up the system until you are at the top of it, and you are happy and you're a ruler of that little world. Then you're dropped right down to the bottom again. You start all over again at the age of 13 in your public school, and you're beaten. This time you are beaten, probably. I was only beaten, I think, once or twice. But physically you're beaten. I'm talking about the time up to the 60s. But mentally, morally, spiritually, you are hammered and hammered into shape a second time. And then, after that, each time it filters out. You're filtered out, and then you go to the third stage. And the university, and I started by looking at that first in my recent book on Cambridge University, Reflections on Cambridge, is about this third stage. The third stage isn't about beating and making of the character, it's about the polishing. It's like the Japanese final polishing of the blade, so it's really sharp. So those 3 years are to take this pretty well-formed character and fairly formed mind and give it that final cutting edge, which will hopefully help it out in the years ahead. Now, you may, I don't know if you find, I'll be interested to hear your response, whether you find this an odd kind of world or an odd kind of system. If you go through it, it seems entirely natural. Some one or two may have you been through it. It's only when you look at it anthropologically from another part of the world, anywhere else in the world, in fact, it strikes you as completely bizarre and crazy. And why should the British have put up with all this stuff and sent their children away, often children from very wealthy homes, to this very primitive kind of asylum for 10 years. If you want to read one wonderful account of a worst case scenario which has affected all our worlds, if you read George Orwell's essay, Such Were the Joys. It's a brilliant account, and basically it suddenly reveals to me at least that George Orwell's 1984 was based on his preparatory school. That world of big brother and surveillance and fear is what he went through as a little boy. But why should they have been through this, and how long has it been going on? As a historian, I came across the pattern many years ago without really thinking about it, when I was studying 16th and 17th century English social history. because what I found was that at that time it seemed to be a very widespread custom for middle-class English people, yeomen and minor gentry and others, to send their children away from home very early. It wasn't just middle class. Poorer people would send their children away to be servants or to be apprentices in other households. And for example, just one or two diaries, for example, Elias Pledger, who wrote a diary, went to school in London at the age of 6 or 7 and sent his son off to school at the age of 8. The future Sir John Branston went to school at the age of 8. And girls also were sent off very young. The Earl of Cork sent his son from Ireland to England to be bred there when the child was 6 3/4. This is 17th century. In fact, as I studied English history further, I discovered that this goes back further and further and further and further, right back into the Middle Ages. The oldest institution in England, possibly, is the English public school. I think Westminster School, it was refounded, but it was originally set up in the 7th century. So it's 1,300 years old, older than anything almost else in our civilization. It was a place where you sent your children to be away from home to board and to perhaps go into the church or into other branches of government. Now, I became particularly aware of it when I saw this, as I say, as an anthropologist looking from outside. And hence I was very interested when I came across an account written by a future pope who was the Italian ambassador to London in 1500. And I think he captures part of the reason for it, which is to do with the English kinship system, in a lovely quote which I'll give you a little bit of. The want of affection in the English is strongly manifested towards their children, for after having kept them at home till they arrive at the age of 7 to 9 years at the utmost, they put them out, both males and females, to hard service in the houses of other people, binding them generally for another 7 to 9 years. And these are called apprentices, and during that time they perform all the most menial offices, and few are born who are exempted from this fate. For everyone, however rich he may be, sends away his children into the houses of others, whilst he in return receives those strangers into his own. And on inquiring their reason for this severity, they answered that they did it in order that their children might learn better manners. But I, for my part, believe that they did it because they like to enjoy all their comforts themselves, and that they're better served by strangers than they would be by their own children. That if the English set away from home to learn virtue and good manners, and took their children away from home and took them back again when their apprenticeship was over, they might perhaps be excused. I mean, he says it might be reasonable to send them out and then have them back again, but they never return. The girls are settled by their patrons and the boys make the best marriages they can. So basically from the age of 7 or 8, you're a stranger in your own home. Now this is related to long-standing features of the Germanic kinship system, which England adopted, the Anglo-Saxon kinship system, and leads and feeds. Now the last point I want to make is that this system, which was present in England the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, accidentally fitted, and I think it was just an accident. At this time, England didn't have an empire, it had overseas possessions in France and one or two other places, but not much. But when the British Empire grew in the 17th century onwards, the pattern fitted beautifully with the large imagined empires, because what happened is you had an added problem here. To take my case, my parents were tea planters in Assam, in India. There were no local schools they could send me to sensibly as they thought. So what could they do? If they wanted me to be properly educated, they sent me home. And they also needed to do this for reasons which they obviously didn't make explicit to themselves, which was to become English. The oddness about the system is that the ideal model and the core, the emotional core of the whole system, is Englishness. So on this tiny island with a few million people, it would generate through this system, through mechanisms which I haven't gone into, the imperial and other rulers. It would take them from India, Burma, the Caribbean, put them through this, and then when they finished, some of them would go back there, others would go into branches of the home power elite and so on. So you get this system of cycling predation, as I call it, because obviously they were living off the empire and sending things home. And what united them all, therefore, was 10 formative years where you learnt British culture, you learnt games, you learnt the songs, you learnt the tribalness of the British, you learnt the humour system. And after that, whether you were in Beijing or in Tokyo or in London or anywhere, you were part of this common, uniform, imagined world, and it was very easy to communicate. You would meet other people of a like disposition, habitus, and be united by that. And it was supposed to create a kind of tough ruler who set an example. I will say now with
they obviously didn't teach me the disposition of
drinking water at the end of the talk. We can't do everything. So this summarises it all. It's the most popular poem in the English language, some say. Certainly used to be. How many of you know the poem If? Okay, you have a treating store then. This is our great imperial theorist, Rudyard Kipling. And this is what I was being taught to read. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too, if you can wait and not be tired by waiting, or being lied about, don't deal in lies, or being hated, don't give way to hating, and yet don't look too good, nor talk too wise. If you can dream, and not make dreams your master, if you can think, and not make thoughts your aim, if you can meet with triumph and disaster, and treat those two impostors just the same, if you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools, or watch the things you gave your life to broken, and stoop and build them up with worn-out tools, if you can make one heap of all your winnings and risk it on one turn of pitch and toss and lose and start again at your beginnings and never breathe a word about the loss, if you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they are gone, and so hold on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings nor lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you, but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and which is more, you'll be a man, my son.